The quizzes starting next week will be written questions, and those always require a little bit more time, but we're still keeping the 5-minute window, all right? So next time, you'll see this, I'll be pulling papers away from people who aren't quite done yet. It's just the way it is. All right, now we've been talking about clever thinking, and today we're going to carry on with clever thinking, but now we're going to talk about clever thinking as it applies to the concept of plate tectonics, which is the fundamental idea holding all aspects of geology together. Before we do that, let's just remind ourselves what we did last time. We were talking about clever thinking as it led up to the development of what is now known as the science of geology. We also introduced some important principles. We also introduced the concept of unconformities. So a reminder, the first geologists are our ancestors. If it were not for the fact that we could think and we could figure out which resources, all of which were geological around us, we would not be here today. And indeed, as I tried to explain to you, you rely more on geology now than any time in our past. We talked about some of the important principles that geologists have, and this is all done in terms of regulating time. So as we develop this course in some of the lectures linked to some of the labs, for example, the lab exercise you get with me next week will be dealing with these principles. You'll understand why it's important to have starting points in terms of time. We talked about the principle of superposition, the idea that in sedimentary successions, rocks that are on the bottom of the pile are older than the ones that are on top. And again, it makes sense. It has to be that way. You can't deposit something unless there's something else on which it is being deposited on. But you have to realize, too, that in geology, although sedimentary rocks originally deposited in horizontal layers, they don't always stay that way, because when you get into tectonics, you start squeezing the rocks, they can be bent up in any direction. And the third of the principles that were originally proposed is the original lateral continuity, the idea that sedimentary rocks are deposited as continuous sheets with some very important exceptions. We also talked about the principles of cross-cutting relationships. If you have an igneous body, and igneous bodies we can date very effectively using certain techniques, but these techniques were not developed until the early 20th century. Prior to this, we still had to get an idea of the relative ordering of things. So cross-cutting relationships allowed us to identify when an igneous body that was originally molten rock cuts through rocks, the body must be younger than the rocks it's actually cutting through. And of course, lastly, the principle of inclusions. If you have two igneous bodies side by side, the older one often has inclusions trapped within the younger one. All 5 of these principles are absolutely vital if you're trying to determine the relative sequence of events. And that's what we're going to be doing in week 2's lab. We also talked about unconformities, also something we'll be dealing with next week. Unconformities are incredibly important, but you have to understand that while it's easy to identify where the rocks are, the gaps between the rocks are in some ways more important than the rocks themselves, because whenever you see a gap in a sedimentary sequence, it tells you something was going on, probably erosion or maybe sea level dropped. It's an important thing to understand, although they are very hard to identify, especially in this type of situation. Disconformities, where you have layer parallel sedimentary rocks sitting on top of layer parallel sedimentary rocks, you could have a gap of many tens of millions of years between them. And the only way you'd be able to identify that is by dating the rocks. And for sedimentary rocks, that's by looking at the fossils. Clever thinkers, we're not going to go into all these guys again, but I do want to remind you that there's Hutton. Hutton is considered to be one of the fathers of geology, but he was one of those people that might have been brilliant in terms of his concepts, but wasn't very good at teaching those concepts to others. Okay, so whatever he was getting on about, in some cases we don't know what he was talking about to this day. And of course, William Smith. We're going to talk more about this guy in an upcoming lecture, because stratigraphy is incredibly important for Earth history as well. Also, the idea of mapping things is important too. Don't forget Lyell. He's the guy who wrote the Principles of Geology, the first truly exceptional geological book. And then, of course, Charles Darwin came up with evolution and other concepts and observations around the world. To this day, geologists, scientists in general, that's what we do. We make observations and we try to figure out what's going on. And to this day, if you're a geology major, you'll have an opportunity to do research. Research means you do something, you look at the data, you try to figure out what the data is telling you, and then you come up with a conclusion that explains something that happened in the past. I've got several students working with me right now, as do all of us, looking at projects. We are actually one of the better departments for encouraging students at the undergraduate level to do research. And the reason is we don't have a graduate program. So we need good students to do good research, and we do it here. Then we kind of finished off talking about Wegener. This is where we're going to start off today. Wegener was a clever observer, and we're now coming into the 20th century. That's the beginning of the 20th century, but it's nonetheless the 20th century. And what Wegener argued, not overly convincing as it turned out at the time, was that sometime in the past, and he estimated 300 million years ago, based upon the distribution of rocks, that many of the continents were all brought together. And he said, you know, back in these days, it was a supercontinent. It was the first usage of the term supercontinent. He called it Pangaea. And although his idea for what caused this to occur did not pan out, his labeling of this supercontinent as Pangaea did. And we're going to talk about Pangaea an awful lot in this class as well. Okay? Now, the supporting evidence, I'm going to go over this a little bit more as well, and I'll mention this now so that when we start off with today's lecture, we can get right into the new ideas. Wegener didn't just look at the way things fit together. He looked at the way the rocks were distributed. For example, he saw evidence in South America of rocks that he knew were deposited in a continental environment that extended from South America into Africa and the other way as well. He also was clever enough to know that the animals that lived in these areas probably had some linkages as well. So he actually found very good evidence of terrestrial animals that lived in South America, but their range extended all the way through Africa. And he had other evidence he used as well. All right, now ultimately I told you his idea, I think the next slide says that, the reaction was widespread rejection. Today, you look at the evidence he amassed as well as the additional evidence, and you go like, how could they possibly have not been able to see this as a really good idea? And the issue is this. Wegener proposed that all the continents were together sometime in the past, but he could not come up with a mechanism to explain how they could have moved away. And you know, if you're dealing with science, making an observation doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to accept it as being real unless you can prove how it might have worked. Case in point, how many of you believe in UFOs? Prove they exist. Unless you have somebody landing in a flying saucer in the White House and having dinner with Obama, most of us are not going to accept it, because scientifically you need to be able to prove it, and simply believing it's not enough. Most people accepted Wegener's ideas as a clever observation, but there could have been other explanations for how it works. Case in point, let's go back here a couple slides. The distribution of the similar rocks on either side of the Atlantic Ocean zone. Well, big deal. Those continental rocks are found on every continent during every single age period, because all it means is you had continental rocks. So just because you saw rocks that were similar in South America and Africa does not mean they were joined together. Throw that one out. The idea that the fit of the continents worked remarkably well, well, it only works remarkably well if you know the distribution where the shelves are. If you actually try to fit South America and Africa together, there's big gaps. Now we know you have to take into account the shelf area as well. When you do that, they fit remarkably well. But the fit was close, but you know, the only thing that counts for closeness is, what does they say? Horseshoes and hand grenades, right? So it wasn't that good. So they threw that evidence out. And as for those animals that seemed to be both in South America and Africa, and this is true, okay? This is what they argued. They said, well, maybe, just maybe, one of the animals over here got washed out in a flood, crawled onto a log, and just floated over to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It had to have been pregnant, and it had to have floated over fast enough that it didn't have birth on this log. I mean, you look at this and you go like, there's no way. But remember Hurricane Katrina? You know what they found on Sand Island? Or Ship Island, sorry, after the hurricane? Pigs. Where did the pigs come from? And by the way, this is about 20 miles offshore. Where did the pigs come from? They got washed in from the rivers, and they floated out, and they stayed alive long enough to get to the island 20 miles offshore. So it could happen, but I would argue that an animal floating across a log across the Atlantic Ocean isn't going to survive that long. So you could find holes, maybe not all that acceptable today, but you could still find holes. Still, because he couldn't come up with a mechanism, everybody rejected it. And it wasn't his fault. Because sometimes clever observations don't have the evidence because we haven't come up with the means by which to determine the evidence we need. That's what we're talking about today, okay? We're going to carry on talking about Alfred Wegener and his concept of drifting continents, but then we're going to start talking about plate tectonics. That is the current idea explaining how everything works. And when I say the plate tectonics revolution, I mean it. This concept, which is so important in geology, and quite frankly, one of the most fascinating ideas in all of science, did not get fully accepted by the scientific professionals until the early 1960s. Because we needed a couple important events, a couple important techniques to be developed before everybody could accept it. And then, in whatever time we have left, we'll talk about plate tectonic mechanisms. If you've had Geology 111 before, or any geography class, or any science class in general, you've heard most of this stuff. If you haven't, and if we don't get through all today's lecture, then don't worry about it, because we'll catch up with this a little bit later on. I'm just giving you background ideas here now. The actual important stuff in terms of Earth history will come a little bit later on. All right, so Wegener is eventually going to get some redemption, but he's not going to get redemption for the idea of continental drift, because frankly, he didn't propose the important mechanism. But he did propose the idea of a supercontinent, and we still recognize him for that. He named Pangaea, and he gets credit for it. But we're not going to start seeing people seriously thinking about this whole drifting continents thing until after World War II. And if you're not already aware of it, wars are terrible things, but wars do one thing that is kind of important. They come up with technology that after the war you apply to more peaceful means. World War II saw technological developments that really have been unrivaled, certainly not until the 20th century. We had submarines as early as the Civil War, but those submarines were basically barrels that leaked. Once we got to World War II, we got better and better and better. Some of these submarines were capable of going down maybe 1,000 feet. Now our submarines can go down a lot deeper than that. When World War II was going on, we were more concerned about not being blown out of the water by another submarine. But once World War II was over, people started making notes of things. For example, every once in a while, one of these things would bump into an underwater mountain. Prior to this, we had done bottom soundings of the oceans. We knew there were shallow areas because we didn't want the shallow areas to knock holes out of the bottom of boats. But most boats didn't have a draft that went down more than about 50 feet. So as long as it was deeper than 50 feet, nobody cared. But when you're in a submarine going at 1,000 feet below the surface, and all of a sudden you bump into an underwater mountain, A, that's bad, but B, it's annoying. So after a while, they started developing techniques that would allow them to look for where the bottom was going to be. Sonar was developed. And when they started developing sonar, all of a sudden they realized something. The oceans were not flat. There had been this idea, when Wegener's time, nobody had done soundings of the ocean, not the whole oceans. They knew where the shallow areas were around continents, but they didn't know that in some places there are underwater mountains that almost make it to the surface of the ocean. And when they finally did map out the ocean so submarines wouldn't bump into them, all of a sudden they found this. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for example, there is a so I'm going to just kill this. There is a great mountain range that exactly parallels and divides the coastlines of North America, Europe, South America, and Africa. You know what? If Wegener had this information when he was proposing things, people would have been able to see that, yes, indeed, Africa, South America all fit in remarkably well on this. We didn't know this until after World War II. And when you start seeing things like this, you start thinking, maybe Wegener's onto something. But the most important piece of evidence that would ultimately really get people forced to think of plate tectonics was also discovered around World War II. It's called paleomagnetism. What does paleo mean? Old. Magnetism is the magnetic field of the Earth. So paleomagnetism literally means the past history of the magnetic field of our planet. It's been well known from day one, basically, that we generate a magnetic field on our planet. And by the way, we are one of only a handful of planets in our solar system that do that. The only rocky planet we know of with a magnetic field. So something's really unique about our planet. It's being generated probably in the outer core of the Earth through just convection currents. But we have a very strong north and a very strong south. We've used this for navigation purposes from the day we first started to sail on the seas. We still use it today. GPSs use this type of technique, as do satellites, okay? But it's not constant. It's been well known, again, for a long time, that over time the magnetic field wanders a little bit. That's because, again, those convection currents are not consistent. So right now, the North Magnetic Pole is in northern Canada. Come back in about 100 years, it's going to be in Russia. The South Pole also wanders around as well. And there's one other thing it does. Every once in a while, north and south tend to change. North weakens, south weakens, and then when it strengthens back up again, sometimes it's reversed. They're called polar reversals. We've been aware of that since about World War II. Now here's how this is useful for geology. This is a lithographic print from Mount Etna, the eruption of 1669. Wow, I just realized that's really fuzzy on this side, isn't it? We have to get that thing focused up here a little bit. What you're looking at is an artist's interpretation of an eruption from Mount Etna in Italy. Remember we talked about Vesuvius? Vesuvius is around the corner from here, one of the first places where people actually described a volcanic eruption. By this time, we know all about volcanoes. We know that if they're erupting, get out, because you might die. But afterwards, in some situations, the only thing you have to do is go back and rebuild the town. So here's a lava flow going through the town. When the lava comes in contact with the buildings, they burn down. That's okay. It cools, you go back, you build on top of it, now you got a higher view. But we also know that if you were to go here now and take a sample of that now solidified, originally molten rock, you could measure the magnetic field that was around at the time of the eruption, back in 1669. Now here's how it works. Molten rock still has minerals in it, and those minerals, in some cases, are magnetic. Those of you who had Geology 111, remember the magnetic mineral? It was called magnetite. If you have any magnetite in your rocks, all the magnetite will align itself up to whatever the magnetic field is of the Earth at the time. As it turns out, most minerals have a certain amount of magnetic susceptibility. And if you have a very powerful means by which to determine things, you can determine which way north and south was, at least in terms of what the arrows were, or in terms of what the orientations were when something was formed. Once the rock solidifies and cools, you trap the orientation of the magnets in whatever orientation the field was. Now, we're not going to go into the details of how this actually works. But if you do this for rocks around the world, you'll very quickly be able to find out how magnetic north and south have deviated over time. But you can also link different parts of continents to other parts of continents according to the magnetic signatures. We realized very quickly, for example, that sometimes rocks that were in Siberia that were produced at the same time as what this was going on as might be slightly different. And that's because their position has shifted relative to this. Well, to make a long story short, if you were to measure the magnetic signatures of this lava flow in 1669, you'd find it's basically the same as what it is today. That's not that long ago. It's only like 500 years ago. That's not much time at all. But if you look at some of these earlier lava flows, and remember, Mount Etna's been around for a while. If you look at one that might be 1 million years older, closer to where the volcano is, all of a sudden you find out it's showing you the reverse directions. North is south, south is north. Because between that interval of time, the polarity reversed itself. That seems to have been worldwide. And we can develop a very good record of how these things have changed over time by simply looking at rocks in order. The bottom of a pile, measure the magnetic orientations, come straight up to the same location. You see the flipping back and forth. If that occurs simultaneously around the world, once we develop the sequence of things, we can actually date rocks very effectively just by comparing their orientation to what the record actually tells us. Now, it takes time to develop that. So we have magnetic paleomagnetism, people running around all over the world, and after a while they develop a pretty good record, and then they start applying it to areas that are really kind of cool. Remember that ridge that went down the Atlantic Ocean, that mountain ridge, which we call the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, by the way? If you go in there and date it, all of a sudden you find out, and this is really weird if you think about it, the youngest rocks are right along the middle of the ridge. Those youngest rocks are being produced by igneous processes. It's a volcanic belt right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Because this is actively erupting today, that's zero. But as you go away in opposite directions, the rocks get older. And here's the key point. They get simultaneously older, or symmetrically older. These rocks are the same age. 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 They're all formed from the same processes that are operating today. And in fact, when you go all the way to the edges here, to close to the continents as you can get, you find the age of the rocks there are symmetrical and almost spot-on identical to the time that Wegener put Pangaea together. There's no choice but to conclude that we must be expanding the Atlantic Ocean symmetrically on either side. The continents are being pushed apart from one another through some sort of geological process. And if you reverse the clock to the time when the continents were together, sometime in the past, in this case is about 150 million years ago, North America and Europe, Africa and South America began to split from one another, and we are moving simultaneously to this day. If Wegener had this information, the concept of continental drift would have been accepted immediately. But we needed time, and it wasn't until about 1955 that we realized a lot of evidence was suggesting some major processes going on in the Earth. Yes, sir?
How long does it take for the poles to switch places?
We'll talk about it a little bit later on. It's variable. Sometimes, the actual time for changing, the amount of time we have right now, we've been in the same orientation for the last 200,000 years, okay? But it's flipped back and forth periodically. It looks like the flipping time can be incredibly short, perhaps as short as 1,000 years. There is indications that we are now starting to go into a change mode. We can measure things very accurately now. So the magnetic fields, both north and south, are weakening, and they've been weakening for at least the last couple decades. So is this signaling an onset when they're going to start to flip? We don't know. We've never seen one of these before. We don't know what's going to happen if they do, except for the fact that your GPS is probably going to be useless, satellites are going to fall from the sky, DirecTV will be off the air, thank God, and birds will not know which direction to fly when winter's coming. But since we're not going to have winter anyway because of global warming, it's not going to matter. Sorry?
We'll be able to live.
How can you live without DirecTV?
Oh, I have Comcast.
Comcast gets a signal from satellites, which gets it's going to be disastrous. The service to McDonald's restaurant will be interrupted. How will we survive with McDonald's? We'll live. Anyway, to fill in the gaps now, we've now dated the age of the oceans, and it turns out that it's remarkable. What you're looking at here now is the age of the rocks that make up oceanic rocks. The red colors, call them the warm colors, are the youngest. The blue colors, the oldest rocks, are colored in the cool colors, okay? So you'll notice that the oldest part of the oceans are up here off the coast of Japan and China. The youngest parts are always along these ridges. So the Pacific Ocean is opening up like this. The Atlantic Ocean is opening up like this. The Antarctic Ocean is opening up like this. If that's all there was, the world would be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. As we'll discuss a little bit later on, there's very clear evidence to suggest that's not happening. They're fairly static in terms of size. If you're creating new oceans somewhere else, pushing the continents along, what do you have to do? Destroy oceans in other places, okay? And indeed, everywhere that you see one of these sharp black lines, especially where you see a sudden transition from really old rocks to young rocks, that's where we are destroying oceanic rocks. And indeed, here's something else that's really fundamentally weird. The oldest continental rocks we've identified on the planet so far, 4.1 billion years old. They're up here in northern Canada. Well, actually, northern Canada and Greenland share that fame. The oldest oceanic rocks we have, about 220 million years. Right there. The rocks that make up the oceans are significantly younger than the rocks that make up the continents. We recycle oceanic rocks through this concept that we now call plate tectonics. The ocean water is at least 4 billion years old, probably older than that. So we have a problem. The age of the water in the oceans is significantly older than the rocks that contain the oceans. Or as someone once said, it's like having a bathtub that is brand new, but the water that's in the bathtub has been there for 20 years. This is the beauty of plate tectonics. You're recycling things below the surface. You're taking some of the oceanic water with you as well. We recycle the oceans through this process, and what you're doing is just reshaping things. I think it's clearly evident that if we did not have this dynamic engine taking place, life as we understand it would not be the way it is now. And I want to reiterate this concept as we go through this course. Geology has been driving evolutionary change from day one. And if we did not have geology doing this, there would be no need for evolutionary development. No evolution means stagnant. the life that we have on this planet would not look anything as dynamic as it is now. So when we start looking for life on other planets, if you want to be able to actually sit down and have dinner with Obama when you land in your spaceship, you better come from a planet that is geologically active, okay? All right, so let's talk about the plate tectonic revolution now, just to fill in some gaps. We now call these boundaries between places where rocks are being created and being destroyed as being plates. Hence the term plate tectonic. The Earth is divided up into a bunch of large plates and a bunch of smaller plates. By convention, we name the plate according to what the dominant thing is on top of it. So for example, we have the North American plate, which consists of North America, but the North American plate goes all the way out to the mid-Atlantic ridge, which includes the west part of Iceland and all of Greenland. That is a body that is moving independently. So everything within the North American plate is moving in whatever direction that plate happens to be moving. As it turns out now, we are moving just to the north of the west a little bit. So call it west-northwest in that direction. Europe is part of the Asian plate. That's one very large plate here. It's moving the opposite direction. By the way, the amount of movement every year is about that much, about an inch. Not very much. But remember, geological time is geological time. That means there might be that amount of movement every single year, but when you're dealing with tens of millions of years, all of a sudden that becomes significant. All right? This is the Pacific plate. The Pacific Ocean is broken up into a bunch of different plates, okay? The Nazca plate, that's the Cocos plate, because of separation and all that. There's the Australian plate. This is wrong, by the way. This should be now called the Australian Indian plate. The Indian plate is attached to the Australian plate. We'll talk about what happened with that a little bit later on. There's the African plate, etc., okay? So all of these plates are moving independently to one another. When they pull apart from one another, you're getting new oceanic crust being produced. When they get pushed together, you destroy oceanic rocks. You're destroying the oceans. There's also places where there's slippage where it passes side by side, okay? Now, let's talk about the evidence that now supports plate tectonics. As I said, it's irrefutable. I don't think there's any way you can ever undermine what plate tectonics is doing, although we still are not absolutely certain about the mechanism. If you think about it, if you've got a plate of rock that contains a continent bumping into another plate of rock that contains another continent, it's going to make a hell of a noise. And indeed, if you think about it, if that noise is translated into something we can measure, which it is, as earthquakes, you should be able to see a direct correlation with where the earthquakes are to where the plate boundaries are. And you do. Now, just to clarify something, this is not all the earthquakes that have ever occurred on the planet Earth. There are some 2 million earthquakes a year. But these are the fairly powerful ones. Anything that is potentially destructive. And you'll notice very clearly they are concentrated along certain plate boundaries. And indeed, the plate boundaries they're concentrated along are the ones where we get this convergence, where oceanic crust is being destroyed. You can get earthquakes along places where crust is being created, but it tends to be not as intensive because it's a more passive thing. But when you push rocks together like this, every once in a while they slip. And when they slip, it generates a tremendous amount of energy, which causes destruction. Now think of some of the more powerful earthquakes we've had in the last decade or so. The one that took out Japan's nuclear power plant is up here. There's the source of the Sumatran tsunami in 1995. 4 or 5. There's the one that took out Christchurch last year as well. Always along places where we have plates pushing against one another or sliding past one another. Volcanoes are also associated with plate boundaries. Now, it should stand to reason you're going to get a lot of volcanoes along places where crust is being produced. You don't see many of them on this diagram because we only identify volcanoes as places where they actually breaks the surface. Most of the mid-Atlantic ridge is under thousands of feet of water. But you got to remember, the water on either side of the mid-Atlantic ridge is 17,000 feet deep. It's deep. And we get a lot of volcanoes where those plates are being pushed together as well. Mountain belts, if 2 continents or 2 plates are being bumped together with one another, there's a significant amount of compression which pushes rocks up, causing linear mountain belts. Now this alone should have been something to prove to the naysayers when Vega was proposing this, that he was onto something, because we don't have mountains randomly around the planet. We have continuous mountain belts that are always at the leading edge for where the compression is taking place. Now, you look at this and you think, it's blatantly obvious. We also see what are called deep sea trenches. A trench is a very deep linear valley in the sea floor. If you have two plates coming together, one being pushed underneath another one, what happens is the overriding plate is not only pushed up, but the leading edge is dragged down. There's friction. So what happens is you get these linear trenches, which are the deepest places in the oceans, which parallel where these convergent boundaries actually are. So the Marianas Trench, the Philippine Trench, the Japanese Trench, these water depths go down to 30,000 feet in some cases. They are as deep as mountains are high on the planet, and they're very, very, very narrow. In fact, it's only recently we managed to send anything down there to see what's on the bottom. It's the pressure down there, you just cannot believe the pressure down there. I mean, it's just ginormous. And you know what we found when we got to the bottom? Things, not just geological things, but living things. There's life at the bottom of the trenches. There's life everywhere. That's another thing that is really kind of cool about this planet. No matter what the environment is, something's going to be living there. I mean, polar bears? What animal would ever want to live on an ice raft? Those do. All right, now let's talk some more about the revolution, because now we're getting into recent time. One of the people that deserves the most credit for this whole idea of plate tectonics is this character, J. Tuzo Wilson. He actually was born and raised near where I lived in Canada, as it turns out. He is responsible for several different things, including the Wilson cycle. Although he did not name it the Wilson cycle, others named it in his honor. The Wilson cycle is one of the first things we're going to talk about when we get into plate tectonics and how plate tectonics has changed. He also characterized these boundaries in the following way. He said those places where oceanic crust is being produced, where plates are literally pulling apart from one another, he called them divergent plate boundaries. So here's where we create new oceanic crust, youngest stuff in the middle. The plates get pulled apart, older stuff gets pushed towards the side. Places where plate is being destroyed, where you're getting compression destroying things, causing mountains to form up, he called these convergent plate boundaries. All right, so you push one plate underneath another, you cause the uprising plate to be pushed up into a mountain belt. And by the way, if you take plate, oceanic rocks, and push it into the interior of the Earth, you take rocks that were originally cool, put them into increasingly hot conditions. The deeper you go, the hotter it gets. Eventually what happens, that stuff melts, all that stuff comes up, and there's where you get your volcanoes from. And then transform fault boundaries, where those boundaries where plates slide past one another. Now there's two exceptional places where you can see this type of action. One is in California. We call it the San Andreas Fault, where part of California is literally on the Pacific plate and is being dragged relative to the North American plate. And by far the best example of a transform fault anywhere in the world is the Alpine Fault of New Zealand. How many of you saw Lord of the Rings? The last movie, where they're sending those fires off in those mountain belts, spectacular scenery. All those mountains are caused because part of New Zealand is being dragged relative to the other part. And the pressures along that have literally pushed one side of the island into the tallest mountains in the southern hemisphere. So really kind of cool things. So how does it all work? In 5 minutes I'm going to explain plate tectonics to you. The Earth is not homogeneous. We've already talked about this. It's heterogeneous. It's been concentrated. There's stuff in the middle that is iron. There's stuff on the outside that is rock. If you were to look in the interior of the Earth, you'd find that there are 4 distinct geophysical boundaries. The thinnest of these is where we live. It ranges from 5 kilometers thick under the oceans to 35 kilometers thick under the continents. Continental crust is significantly thicker than oceanic crust. It's the outermost part of our planet. Then we have the next layer of rock, the mantle. It's one of the thickest bodies we have in our planet. It is rock, but it's rock that becomes increasingly plastic as you go in the interior. Now the idea is that the interior of the Earth is hot. At the surface, where it's cool, the rocks are rigid. But as you get deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually you don't really melt the rock all that much. But what happens is you start to convert it by pressure and temperature into something that has more of the behavior of toothpaste. So the rocks in the mantle tend to range from being rigid near the outer surface to being very ductile. Then we pass into the core. There's 2 components of the core. The outer core is liquid metal. That's where a magnetic field is being generated. So it's very hot. And then the inner core is solid metal. And by the way, there's some new ideas suggesting that there might be an inner core. We still haven't figured out why the Earth is still hot. By all interpretations, eventually the Earth will cool off in the interior. When that happens, our magnetic field dies, and it may actually be bad for us. But that apparently is not going to be for many tens of millions of years. But if you do the math on this, the Earth should have gone solid many, many tens of millions of years ago. Venus, for example, our companion, same size as us, it has a solid core. It does not have a magnetic field. So why don't we? Some people have suggested that we may have another component in here that might be a ball of solid uranium, the heaviest stuff we know. A ball of uranium might actually be a nuclear reaction going on. We may have a huge nuclear reactor in the center of our planet, which is keeping the planet artificially warm. Where did that extra uranium come from? Sorry? Oh, the supernova generator, but it's all through our solar system as it comes to condense. So we should have got our fair share of uranium the same way as Venus did. But remember the formation of the moon? If they're right on that, if something about the size of Mars hit us, all the light stuff gets blasted out to form the moon. The stuff that was part of that Mars-sized body, we may have increased our uranium and iron content by adding another planet to us. So these are, I mean, there's no way you can document that or prove it unless you get a time machine. But still, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So, in terms of how this works, it's hot in the interior of the Earth, cool at the exterior of the Earth, and this sets up a process called convection. So the idea now is that there are plumes of hot rock that rise upwards towards the surface, and when they get to the surface, they cool off and eventually descend back down again. All right? So this concept here has been ballyhooed for many, many years. Where you get convection, that's where you get divergence. Where the currents come down, you drag things back down. It's, as I said, been something that's been around since plate tectonics was first really pushed in the 1960s, and now we know it's almost certainly wrong. But still, let's look at how things have changed in terms of the concept. As early as 1928, Arthur Holmes proposed this convection currents aspect of things. And the idea now, and I'm out of time in just a minute, so I'm going to scroll through this and come back and do this when we meet on Monday. But I want to show you how the convection currents are thought to deal with things, okay? Ignore that, but look at this. If you have a convection current rising up like so, this rigid layer up here, which is cooler, is going to feel tension. And with tension, you can split things apart. So the idea originally was that plate tectonics was caused by convection pulling things apart and then pushing them together where mountains are formed during the convergent plate boundaries. All right, important thing to note. The geophysical layers, which involve the very thin crust and part of the mantle, this is the part that is rigid. So really, when you start thinking about plate tectonics, the crust and the uppermost part of the mantle are the things that behave as rigid materials and breaks. So it's not like we're talking about the crust being the movement here. It's actually the crust plus the uppermost mantle. So we have to have different names for these. If you already had Geology 111, you know this. The part that behaves rigidly is called the lithosphere. It's 100 kilometers thick, involves the crust plus whatever part of the mantle is behaving rigidly. Below this, the ductile part of the mantle is called the asthenosphere. Now those terms are the tectonic terms. So when we're talking about plate tectonics, we're talking about the lithosphere breaking up into these chunks of material and moving relative to one another. But the lithosphere, that's the important part. This is the part that forms the bumper car component. When it's subjected to forces, it breaks into plates which bump into one another, hence earthquakes, etc. Okay? So the idea, if you want to look at the old style of stuff, is that convection causes tension. Where you get tension, the plates start to break apart. Now, one thing before we go further on this. These diagrams you see here are designed to give you an idea how the concept works. At no place on this planet can you or have you ever been able to stand on the edge and see a crack that goes down 100 kilometers into the interior of the Earth. What happens is when the rocks start to break, you have what are called rift valleys forming, where segments start to sink into this interior of the Earth. Okay, we'll talk about rift valleys when we get to plate tectonics again in this course a little bit later on. Now, a reminder. you have three ways in which each of those plates can interact with one another. Divergent plate boundaries, as exemplified by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the East Pacific Rise down here in the Pacific, are places where new oceanic crust is being produced. Remember, this is where the paleomagnetic striping is taking place. The youngest parts of the oceans are always along these mid-oceanic ridges, like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This is where you have volcanoes forming and some earthquakes. But to be honest, neither the volcanoes nor the earthquakes are particularly really nasty. Iceland, which you cannot see because Iceland is buried somewhere in here, Iceland lies right along the ridge. And while Iceland does have problems with volcanoes, most of the time the Icelandic volcanoes are the ones that aren't going to cause any issues whatsoever, because when they erupt, it's just lava flowing at the surface of the earth. As long as the lava doesn't wash into a village, things are cool. But you start talking about nasty places to live, where potentially volcanoes will wipe out tens of thousands of people, go to a convergent plate boundary. Because here, when you start destroying lithosphere below the surface, the melting that takes place here as the plate is pushed or drawn deeper into the interior of the Earth gives rise to volcanoes that are characterized by potentially explosive volcanic activity. Mount Vesuvius is one of these that Pliny saw. Mount Pinatubo, Mount Krakatoa. Anything that is involved explosive eruptions potentially can kill thousands with very little warning. There was a volcanic eruption in New Zealand in the late 1800s. Nobody knew this one was coming. When it erupted, it killed hundreds of people in a country that only had a few thousand people to start with, okay? And then lastly, transform fault boundaries. Now, as I said, the example I gave you was the San Andreas Fault as it goes through Southern California here. And every once in a while, the two parts of the sides, and remember, we're talking about a 100-kilometer thick block that is sliding past another 100-kilometer thick block. Every once in a while, it binds up, and when it lets go, there's a major earthquake. Now, one of the worst places to live in the world if you don't like earthquakes is San Francisco, because the San Andreas Fault goes right through San Francisco. Los Angeles, which is quite a ways away from it, up until 1974, they didn't think they had to worry about earthquakes. Think again. Because it is time to call it quits for this week. Yahoo! 2 weeks down. If you haven't already done so, download, read the notes. You don't have to print them off, but make sure you read them when you have a chance. Start studying. You can never start studying too early, okay? Next time we meet, Clever Thinking Part 3. We'll finish off today's lecture, and then we'll talk a little bit about stratigraphy and time. We're talking about William Smith again. I will give you back your quizzes on Monday. Have a good weekend. Those of you going to Chuck E. Cheese's, don't do it. Don't do it.